Hello and welcome to the commemoration event for the 76th anniversary of the Port Chicago explosion. My name is Tom Leatherman and I'm speaking to you today from the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial. Every year we hold a commemoration ceremony to honor and remember those who died and those whose lives were forever changed on July 17, 1944. This year we are not able to conduct a ceremony in person due to the safety concerns of COVID-19 pandemic. But we didn't want to miss the opportunity to commemorate and honor the brave men who served at Port Chicago Naval Magazine. In 2009, President Barack Obama designated this site the 392nd unit of the National Park System. The explosion at Port Chicago was the worst homefront disaster of World War II, where 320 men were killed and over 400 were injured when two ships loaded with munitions exploded. The events following the explosion, including the work stoppage, the largest mutiny trial in history, and the subsequent court-martials of the black sailors, are critical for understanding the importance of this site. In particular, it is important that we find a way to share this history with you now. As our country continues to perpetuate racial injustices against African American citizens, the Port Chicago site stands as a stark reminder of those same injustices during World War II. You see, the Port Chicago site was set aside to help us remember that black lives do matter. Although the loss of any 320 lives is worthy of a memorial, and the memorial honors all of those who were killed, the very fact that most of the men were African American is ultimately the main reason the site was set aside at all. These events were the primary reason for the desegregation of the armed forces following World War II and helped plant the seeds for the civil rights movement in the 1960s. The significance of the site to our nation's history is being preserved here for current and future generations to learn from, reflect on, and gain inspiration from. Let me take a step back for a minute. In the National Park System, there are 419 sites across all 50 states where we preserve and protect the natural and cultural history of our country. Most of the first 100 years of the National Park Service history, people of color were largely not reflected in the stories that we shared and the sites we preserved. Only when sites like Manzanar, Sand Creek Massacre, Tuskegee Airmen, Cesar Chavez, and Port Chicago were established did we start to include the histories of all of our citizens, whether we were proud of that history or not. As we move forward, we hope that we can not only find new sites, like the ones I mentioned, to tell some of these missing stories, but we hope that all national parks can begin to share untold narratives of people of color who helped to shape those parks as well. Only when we are inclusive in the way that we record, share, and preserve our history will we understand our true legacy and fully realize the potential and importance of the National Park System. Over the next half hour, we will share some of the specifics of the Port Chicago history with you. Some of what you will see has been prepared for you with new messages from our friends and partners today, but we also wanted to share some of our footage from past commemoration events for those who have not been to the memorial or participated in an event in the past. Our goal in this program is to honor all of those who lost their lives and those who were impacted by the explosion and to remember the historic events that followed. In that remembering, we hope that you will be part of our effort to make sure that this history is not forgotten, and we hope that you too will see that black lives do indeed matter. The memorial is located on an active military base called the Military Ocean Terminal Concord and is operated by the Army, specifically the 834th Transportation Battalion. I have invited the Army today to share a few words with you.
Ladies and gentlemen and honored guests, welcome to the Port Chicago disaster of 1944 virtual memorial ceremony. My name is Lieutenant Commander Tom House, U.S. Navy. I am the Executive Officer for the 834th Transportation Battalion and the Military Ocean Terminal Concord, currently known as MACO, and formerly the Port Chicago Naval Magazine. MACO is the only Department of Defense installation with an active National Park Service monument, and as COVID-19 restrictions relax, we would be honored to provide access to this important national memorial. This historic site honors those who made the ultimate sacrifice and raises awareness of the disaster and subsequent events. Today we reflect on the history of MACO, and more importantly, remember and honor our fallen military brothers. At this site, on July 17, 1944, this disaster was the country's largest single explosion and the largest home front loss of life of World War II. The explosion killed 320 service members, injured 390 civilians and military service members, and among the 320 dead, 2/3 were African American. At that time, all the armed forces were still segregated, and black sailors were not afforded the same post-event survivors leave as their white counterparts. While many went back to work, 50 courageous black sailors, known as the Port Chicago 50, refused to return to work out of fear of another explosion, lack of improvement in safety conditions, and overall shock. It was through the Port Chicago 50's precarious stand in the face of insurmountable odds that resulted in one of the most important reforms in our country, the desegregation of the military. Desegregation started in the Navy, and in 1946, the Navy prohibited all segregation in its assignments and ranks. And in 1948, 4 years later, President Theodore Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9981 that ordered the desegregation of all the armed forces. Today, our United States military is an institution that embraces diversity and inclusion and rejects hate and prejudice in all its forms. This specific monument pays tribute to those who lost their lives in service of our great nation. It also stands as a beacon of light and an inspiration for a better tomorrow. On this 76th anniversary of the Port Chicago disaster and the events that followed, today, July 17, 2020, we remember the Port Chicago 50. Those African American heroes paved the way for today's sailors, soldiers, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen. And while we have come a long way in combating racism in the military and within our country, we take today to remember where we were in 1944 and where we still need to go. Rest assured that your military will uphold our oath to protect and defend the rights and freedoms of all Americans. We ask that you observe a moment of silence to remember those who made the ultimate sacrifice at the Port Chicago disaster of 1944. At this time, I ask you to join me for a moment of silence. Thank you for joining us virtually on this beautiful Friday morning to honor our nation's heroes.
Kelly, it's 1944. Let's imagine what was going on out here.
Well, in 1944, Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial was a very, very busy place. It was one of a handful of deep water munition ports that the Navy maintained here on the West Coast. And the location was ideal. They needed a place that was relatively close to a populated area in order to be able to have labor and access to railways and rail cars to be able to bring in the munitions and then load them onto ships that were then bound for the Pacific Theater.
So if we were here in 1944, we'd have some ships right here being loaded up with munitions to go out to the Pacific.
Exactly. You'd have a massive dock that could host two ships lined up opposite ways, so that you could have the rail cars come right up the dock and be able to load from the middle out onto each ship. And load lots and huge. And when I say munitions, we're talking lots and lots of different types of munitions, warheads, and bombs, and all kinds of stuff. Basically, I think it's said that almost every piece of munition that was used in the Pacific Theater passed through Port Chicago.
Loaded
or
on
one
the
of the
ships,
others. Yeah.
out through the bay, out through the Golden Gate, out to the Pacific, as that war waged on here.
Indeed, and especially in the wake of Pearl Harbor, there was a massive, massive buildup. They actually did envision the need for this particular weapons station prior to Pearl Harbor, but so the plans were already laid, but then when that attack occurred, everything was ramped up very quickly, and this base, more or less, opened as a naval magazine at the summer of 1942.
So again, going now to 1944, this was a busy place.
Yep.
Ships were coming and going, munitions were being loaded.
We were in the thick of the war, and so there was a lot of, and in fact, there was a big push to try to get as many ships loaded and out as fast as possible, to the point where it became a safety issue, because many of the officers, they were in charge of these companies of men who were in charge of all this loading and packing and transporting, and they would actually encourage their crews to race each other to see who could load the ships the fastest. And when you actually look at the rates that they were loading at a rate pretty comparable to those of professional stevedores that worked over in like in the Port of Oakland and other areas. But again, it was wartime, and they really wanted to just push to get as much loaded as quickly as possible. And unfortunately, there was little or no safety training that was given to these men who were handling this incredibly volatile stuff. And unfortunately, as a result of all of this racing, and really disregard for any sort of safety standards, the unthinkable did ultimately end up happening.
July 17th, 1944, what happened here?
Well, it was in the evening. It was about 10:18 p.m. And I should say that we will never know exactly what happened, because anyone who was close enough to have seen exactly what happened was obliterated as a result of the explosion.
An immense explosion.
Yes. So what we do know, we know from survivors who were further away from this immediate loading area, far enough away to have survived and to have guessed at what may have happened. So what we do know for sure is that there were two explosions. First, one small explosion, followed a few seconds later by a massive explosion. And this explosion was so powerful that it actually registered as a 3.4 on the Richter scale, as if it were an earthquake. The impact was felt throughout the entire Bay Area, and it shattered windows as far away as in San Francisco. And debris rained down in a large radius as well. In Walnut Creek, there were reports of debris falling from the sky, all the way, even just as far as this entire circle here was more or less the debris circle that we know of.
This is the debris field right here where Port Chicago is.
From Walnut Creek down here all the way up into not quite Vallejo, but over in these areas right here on the other side of the bay.
But damage, sounds, everything in this entire radius, all the way to San Francisco, up to Petaluma, all the way out.
Throughout literally the entire Bay Area, of course, felt the impact of this.
And so this was a massive tragedy, and a great tragedy with huge loss of life, but it was also a tragedy with profound controversy involved in it. Describe, what is the story here? What is the underlying story that's so important for us to know and understand?
Yeah, and that's the fascinating part. In some ways, the explosion was just the beginning of a much larger narrative. You see, part of the reason that the disaster occurred, I mentioned the lack of safety protocols, but the other part of it that underlay everything about how this base operated is that for the most part, most of the sailors who worked here loading those munitions, doing that horribly dirty, dangerous work, were African American sailors. Now, this is at a time when all of the armed forces were segregated. We do hear about the Tuskegee Airmen who arose during this time and began to be trained as pilots. But for the most part, most jobs in the Navy that were available to African Americans were just those of cooks or say stevedores loading munitions like this. You could not really serve as a sailor alongside other white sailors in the Navy. That sort of segregation and discrimination continued, even in the immediate wake of the tragedy. For example, many of the sailors who survived had the unfortunate, horrible task of trying to start cleaning up this incredible area. And when I say cleaning up, I mean that they were not only picking up debris, they were recovering remains of their comrades. And I mean, this would give anyone, this would be traumatic for anyone. And the white officers who were involved with this effort were all given hazard leave, and they were allowed to take time off. But the African American sailors were ordered right back to work.
And most of those killed
were African
Americans. And those then had to do the cleanup were mostly African Americans.
Yep.
And then the war was still being waged, and so they were ordered back to work?
They were. And again, they were treated differently than their white officers were, in that the white officers were given some time off to recover, but the black sailors were ordered right back to work doing the same hazardous job that had just gotten their friends blown up. And so after most of the cleanup effort had ended, most of the sailors were transferred over to Mare Island near Vallejo, and they went through and did some work there. And then I think it was only about just a few weeks after the disaster, they were given the order to go back down to the docks and start loading ships again. And at that point, about 200 of them stopped short. 250 or so of them stopped short, and they refused to load.
And the refusal to load was based on what?
It was based on fear and on trauma, because again, no one knew exactly what had happened that caused these ships to blow up.
But
they had often been told things that, like, oh well, you know, these aren't live, this isn't real, these are this, but they're not. There's no detonators on these bombs, and they were sort of led to believe that the work that they were doing was important, but not necessarily life-threatening. And then the explosion obviously proved that that was not the case. And so, of course, to refuse an order during an act of wartime is technically an act of mutiny. And so they were threatened with mutiny, and about 200 or so of them gave in and went back to work and were disciplined, severely disciplined, for having refused to work. But about 50 of them held fast and said that they did not want to go back to loading these materials. And so they were imprisoned, and they were then all tried together in the largest mutiny trial in U.S. naval history. And they were all 50 were convicted of mutiny, which seems a great injustice, and it was a great injustice. And in fact, this trial made news and made headlines around the country. All of the black newspapers, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, they were all following this. The NAACP sent one of their best young lawyers, a guy by the name of Thurgood Marshall, down to monitor the trial. But and what did come out of the trial, though, despite the convictions, was the fact that the Navy was operating using all of these discriminatory, disparate standards in terms of having only African Americans do the dirtiest, most dangerous jobs without much training. And so all of this bad behavior by the Navy came to light during this trial. And so the irony is, despite the injustice of those 50 sailors having been convicted of mutiny, the result was that the Navy had to start changing its practices with regard to how it assigned work to African Americans versus other sailors. And so ironically, the Navy started using African Americans in other jobs and putting white sailors into some of these jobs as well. And later in 1948, when Truman issued the executive order essentially desegregating the armed forces, the Navy by that point, ironically, was well on its way to desegregation as a result of what had happened here at Port Chicago, and what then came out in the course of the mutiny trial, and how they had to change some of their practices.
These are important stories for us to really understand.
Absolutely.
To know who we are and to know where where we've come from and maybe where we're going.
Absolutely. One of the best things that we can do to honor their legacy is to tell their story and to explain just how their story and their losing their lives resulted in these enormous events that shaped the course of our country at that time. And I'd like to think that although we cannot make up for the injustice that was done to those who lost their lives and those who were convicted, we can at least honor them by telling their story and making sure that we remember those lessons.
My work has actually been about memory. It's been about the remembrance of Port Chicago. What I realized is that the voices of the sailors who served here were not in the official history. They were not even really in the trial transcript, because the court, the military court at the time, had ruled that any testimony about events prior to July 17th, that is about events of the work that was being done here, that any testimony about that was irrelevant, could not be introduced at the trial. So the sailors were not even able to tell the story of the work that was done here and the problems that were occurring in that work, as you know now. The voices of the sailors were missing, and I realized if I wanted to really understand what had happened here, I would have to locate some survivors all those years later now and to interview and ask them about what had happened. I did that over a period of several years, interviewing survivors who happened to be all over the country. Very few of them actually stayed in the Bay Area. They went back home. Home was on the East Coast, home was in the South, and that's where I found people to interview. And in the course of doing these interviews, I found the story then that I've written in that book. And I also realized, though, that the story needed to be, more people really needed to be involved in this work. It was certainly much more than any one person could do. And that, in fact, the stories that were being told were bringing forward even more people who had been here at one time, or people who had served in the military and had similar experiences. In any case, during this time, it was, while it took some years to recover these stories, it also became very apparent as I was doing the interviews that many of the men had actually never told anyone about what had happened, about their stories of being here. They'd never, not even told their families. And so the urgency of doing this work became even more evident to me. The urgency of collecting the stories before the stories become lost to all memory. These events have become a way then for all of us, in fact, to remember Port Chicago. And I finally come to understand then the calling that has brought us here. The calling which is to tell the story of the people, the men who lived and served and died here, to tell that story to larger and larger audiences, and to make sure that this part of the nation's history is never forgotten again. Thank you.
We are grateful for the research Dr. Allen has done and for his book, The Port Chicago Mutiny, which has provided the foundation for our work. Greetings. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Reverend Diana McDaniel. I serve Unity Church of San Leandro as its senior minister. I also serve as president of the Friends of Port Chicago National Memorial, along with David Salniker and Mark Brunner, John Lawrence, Cameron Madigan. We all work to keep the story alive. I want to say thank you to our friends, all of our friends, for their support. And let me say that our trustees are a special group of people who are talented and mission-driven. The Friends of Port Chicago National Memorial is a non-profit corporation. Our mission is to honor those who died, those who were injured in that horrific explosion. We also pay tribute to those who served and who protested. And we work to clear the records of those who were found guilty of mutiny. We work to increase public knowledge so that this story is never forgotten. Our Friends group works collaboratively with the East Bay Regional Park District, and we are official partners with the National Park Service. We love working with the General Superintendent Tom Leatherman and his park rangers. We thank all of the park rangers for their maintaining and caring for the 392nd National Park. Park rangers are indeed special people. Thank you to Brian Holt, Beverly Lane, Bob Doyle, and all of the East Bay Regional Park District for accepting the more than 2,000 acres from the Navy for a great regional park where the Port Chicago Visitors and Interpretive Center will be. Thank you also to the City of Concord for your support. Our greatest thank you goes to the men and their families who made the ultimate sacrifice on that fateful day 76 years ago. Thank you to those who served at this facility and made a difference in the lives that we live today. We acknowledge families of those Navy men, maritime servicemen, Coast Guardsmen, contractors, civilians who perished. We thank you and we honor your families. Another casualty was the town of Port Chicago, and we acknowledge your sacrifice. Out of the rubble, out of the pain of that tragic day and that tragic war, something new had to come, a new way of living. So again, we say thank you to those who served, died, were injured, and those who protested. Thank you to all who are remembering Port Chicago today. This year, we have a special thank you to the Honorable Congressman Mark DeSaulnier, who was selected as this year's awardee for the Friends Commemorative Heroes Award. We're glad to see you doing so well, Congressman. Mark DeSaulnier has been our hero, our champion, since enthusiastically accepting the torch passed to him from Congressman George Miller. We thank you, Congressman DeSaulnier, for bringing national attention to the Port Chicago story when in July 2015, we watched you lead members of Congress in statements recognizing the injustice suffered by the Port Chicago 50. We watched a live feed of statements on the House floor in Washington, D.C. We remember jumping for joy to see you doing this. And more recently, there was language enacted into law with the Defense Authorization Law in 2019 that was a significant step towards recognizing the inequity of the action taken against the sailors. We're on our way to exoneration. So for all of the good work you've done for our nation, in your community, and for the Port Chicago 50, we salute you. The award reads, Friends of Port Chicago National Memorial salute Congressman Mark DeSaulnier as its 2020 commemorative hero for his extraordinary leadership in seeking racial justice for those convicted of mutiny in the aftermath of the Port Chicago disaster. Thank you, sir. We salute you.
Hello, everyone. I'd just like to begin by thanking the Friends of Port Chicago for this wonderful recognition and more importantly for being who you are, for continuing to be so persistent to honor these men and to honor the best that's in us, and particularly at this point in our history. So thank you so much. When I got the letter from Reverend Diana, I was it was really a wonderful thing to be recognized. And thank you for your continued work, and I will continue to work on it. The work itself has been very, very meaningful to get us to this point, and I want to thank John Lawrence to helping us so much with getting us to this point, and George Miller, and of course all of you. So thanks. Look forward to the opening, the funding, the construction, the opening to the Visitor Center where people can continue and we can keep the story alive. And at this point where we're so hopeful that we're finally at a point of national reconciliation and recognition of our history, I think it's important to remember a wonderful quote that I was introduced to because of Port Chicago by a young Thurgood Marshall when he came to Treasure Island to serve on the defense team of those young men who only wanted to serve this country. When the future Supreme Court Justice said, "I am here not just to defend these innocent men, but I'm here to defend our national creed." Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Bob Doyle, and I want to wish everybody a good day. We're on the dividing ridge between East Contra Costa County and Central Contra Costa County, where in Central Contra Costa County 300,000 people live, and this is their new park. Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of our brand new park. This, for decades, was a very important military base and naval weapons station starting in World War II, and it was decommissioned about 15 years ago, and we were very anxious to see that some of this property isn't developed for important economic growth, but is preserved in perpetuity for the public to enjoy. The Park District had an opportunity to work with our great partners, the National Park Service, to see that part of this land under federal law could come to the East Bay Regional Park District as a public park. But it wasn't a simple process. Actually, it took 4 Congress members to get to where we are today. Congresswoman Ellen Tauscher started the process with creating the regional park here. Then Congressman Garamendi had this area, and then it went to Congressman George Miller, and then it now is in the Congressional District of Mark DeSaulnier. It took a lot of effort and some controversy. There were proposals for more development here. There were proposals for a bigger park, but mainly it was really trying to establish how big this park would be. But the planning process moved forward, working cooperatively with the city, establishing an advisory committee, and going through that process, working with our Congress members to get the formal approval to say where the park would be. So very, very exciting, but a lot of work, a lot of effort. And so when the East Bay Regional Park District knew that it in fact would get this property, we started our own land use planning process. We had numerous public workshops with great attendance from both near and afar, and really talked about what is the vision for this park. After all, it was a military base, so how do you turn this into a park? And the predominant goal, working with both wildlife agencies and the public, was to make it a very passive park because there's so much population here, to preserve that habitat, to preserve some of the history, but also have recreation here. And that is the goal of the East Bay Regional Park District at this park.
I'm Beverly Lane, Director for the East Bay Regional Park District for the Concord area and for the new Concord Regional Park. I've been involved in planning for this park since 1999. 2020 is a memorable year for all of us in many ways, but in looking at this new regional park, it's going to be memorable because this summer the East Bay Regional Park District Board of Directors will adopt their land use plan. These land use plans determine what the park will look like, where the staging area will be, where the visitor center will be, what parts will open, and how things will be financed. So when you look at this year, appreciate that this one positive thing will be happening.
I wanted to talk a little bit about this incredible grassland that we have here. This brand new park will be over 2,500 acres, and it will be a grassland preserve, but it has over 28 miles of new trails, paved roads, dirt paths that people will be able to enjoy these incredible views of the surrounding many regional parks, which we'll talk about later in the video. But this is really a complement to that great system of 73 regional parks in the East Bay. And the Park District has always had a visionary planning of connectivity, not only connected to the populations we serve, but connecting these lands. And it's part of the focus and part of the long-term effort of your East Bay Regional Park District.
From this beautiful vista we see rolling hills with an epic, uninterrupted view of Mount Diablo to one side and a glistening shoreline to the other. 76 years ago, this view was not as tranquil. The nearby shoreline is where the tragic Port Chicago explosion occurred on July 17th, 1944. As a result of that destructive explosion, the Navy sought to expand their footprint and to create a larger buffer between loading operations and the local community, which brings us back here in the hills, once known as the Concord Naval Weapons Station. Through eminent domain, the military took over 5,000 acres and built dozens of storage bunkers of various sizes. Looking across the hills, you see around 200 magazines with a total holding capacity of 94,000 tons of munitions. Munitions magazines were designed to hold up to 70,000 pounds of fuses and detonators for use during World War II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and even up to the Gulf War. Long-term storage of munitions was moved into these new bunkers and magazines as a safety measure, a step to ensure another tragedy did not happen. In 1999, the military began to mothball the Concord Naval Weapons Station with plans to end activity. When the hustle and bustle settled down, nature began to reclaim the land. Today, the future park balances the natural world with strong connections to the past and the history that makes this area sacred.
We're in the center part of this brand new East Bay Regional Park District in Concord, the former Concord Naval Weapons Station. We are at the site of a future visitor center for the public. We will be able to work with the National Park architects and planners, as well as our own, to look at how we use some of these buildings. And one of the things we want to do here is to tell its history, as well as the natural and cultural history of a park, including restoring a lot of this property to natural habitat. And off to my right is an artifact from the period where rail cars were operating, and occasionally they would spark a fire. And that car is a tank car that was just for water in case there was a need for immediate firefighting, because a lot of this was not connected to the cities back, if you think about the 40s and 50s. So it's one of the things we're trying to do is to repurpose some of the property here. It's a big challenge. It's very exciting. And with a new visitor center here, we're very excited about this brand new park in Concord to serve the entire East Bay and our additional park system, a park 3 times the size of San Francisco. So we're looking forward to opening this park and raising the money to fund this visitor center and make this a beautiful park.
Here at our new regional park, we are looking at a landscape that has been transformed over many years. First by the Baymiwak Chupkan, later by the Hispanics who came through and began the ranching, and then agriculture and the military. So this is a park which, when it opens, we will be able to tell stories of resistance and resilience as we can in no other park in the district. The Park District's new regional park came about because of so many people. We have partners in many directions. Of course, the people of Concord and the City Council are at the top. We also have the National Park Service, which supported us in receiving the park through beneficial conveyance. Then there were people from all over. The Friends of Port Chicago, concerned citizens, Save Mount Diablo, and our own staff at the Park District did yeoman work in putting it together, with staff from planning, stewardship, legal, and operations. I just want to thank everybody for their involvement in this and their support for this great new regional park.
My name is Robert Harris. I'm the nephew of Eugene Coffey, Jr. My uncle Eugene was one of the African American sailors who died at the Port Chicago disaster. He was one of 11 children and my mother's oldest brother. I'm sure the story of how he ended up at Port Chicago is not much different than many of the other men who served and died there with him. A young black man living in America in the late 30s, especially in the Deep South, was far from easy. And enlisting in the service to serve your country during wartime was probably his best option. Remembering what happened at Port Chicago is extremely important to my family on a very personal level. It took 73 years from the time of his death for his family to know the true circumstances surrounding his death. The truth about what actually happened at Port Chicago was steeped in racism and injustice, swept under the rug, disavowed, and ignored by the United States Navy and America at large. I have so many mixed emotions about this whole affair. I feel sadness, I feel anger, I feel a sense of pride, and a long-awaited sense of closure. I remember as a young boy asking my mother, "Mom, what happened to your brother, Eugene?" And she simply said, "All we know is that he was blown up on a ship." And there was always this look of sadness in her eyes whenever she spoke about it. All of my uncles, sisters, and brothers, including my mother, have long since passed on. They never had a memorial service or funeral for him. For all they knew, his remains could have been inside some ship at the bottom of the ocean. They never received any closure. So we, all of my uncle's nieces and nephews, receive closure for them, knowing that he is loved, honored, and remembered, and that all of them are together with our Lord. All of these men who served their country at Port Chicago deserve justice and vindication. The ones who died and the ones who survived. The systemic racism and bigotry they endured is still going on. As Dr. King stated, it is a fight for the soul of America. In God's eyes, all of us are our brother's keeper. The Bible tells us that it is impossible to love God and hate your brother, because loving God and loving your brother is one in the same. It's time for change. It's time to make this country into what God intended for it to be. Thank you.
I never got to meet my Uncle Junie. He was killed in the Port Chicago explosion, and like many of the seamen who met their untimely death during that disaster, his remains were never found.
My mother was just 7 years old in 1944. She recalls her most vivid memory of Brother Junie, as she called him, as a time when he was coming home one day. She saw him in the distance and ran up to him, giving him a big hug. He picked her up and put her on his shoulders and carried her home.
I was in the military for over 20 years before my mother told me about this memory of Uncle Junie. She told me how he had served in the Navy during World War II loading ships in Port Chicago, and gave me a copy of Dr. Robert Allen's book, The Port Chicago Mutiny. She recalled that Uncle Junie was supposed to be on leave that day, but swapped duty with a shipmate. That would be his last kind act of service. His service to our country led the way for his brother George, a soldier, and his brother August, a Marine.
Fellows-Brett family members continued to serve our country during peace and wartime. My sister Allison retired from the Army National Guard. My cousin Martin retired from the Air Force. My cousin Marcellus served in the Air Force as well. My cousin Jay served in the Army.
My cousin Tony served in the Army. And I retired from the Air Force Reserve after 30 years of service. We all stand on the shoulders of Uncle Junie and thank him for his ultimate sacrifice for our nation and paving the way for desegregation in the military.
I want to thank everybody for attending this year's virtual commemoration. My name is Armand Johnson, and I am the Public Affairs Specialist for Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial. I first learned about the park in my first year of college as I was volunteering with the National Park Service. This story is important to me because it highlights racial injustices, but it also talks about a time of change after this racial injustice. I'd like to thank all folks involved in putting together this virtual commemoration. I'd like to thank the East Bay Regional Parks District. I'd like to thank the Friends of Port Chicago and the Army. If anyone has any questions about any future tours, please log on to our website. Updates will be posted there. Thank you.